I think the surface fleet is a magnificent example of a complex organization. It has a complex mix of people, technology, missions, uncertainty.
Especially in these complex systems, there's so much and they're so interconnected. You kind of get lost in the weeds before you even start.
The systems are so critical, the technology's so complex, but there's still a human that needs to push the button. There's still a tech that needs to turn the wrench. There's still a navigator that needs to make sure we're sailing in the right direction.
Technology, in its best sense, makes it simple for us humans to process the information and act on that information. Technology, at its worst, complicates.
And we see this in a number of mishaps where something goes wrong, and now the operators are looking around saying, I don't know what is actually going on.
Driving a ship and you're trying to figure out how to do something, that's the wrong time to do it.
We're designing systems in which human error is inevitable, and then we blame it all on the operator.
Operators often enhance the weaknesses in a design. They do workarounds. You know, the way this is designed doesn't work, but we found a workaround that actually works.
When the workload exceeds their capacity, then they have to cut corners. I've got to get 28 hours of work done in a 24-hour day and still have enough time to sleep.
Inevitably, folks are going to have issues come out of that. McCain, Fitzgerald, fatigue, and sleep deprivation were big components.
And so we'll say, well, we'll just fire the operator, retrain the operator. And really the problem is you have to redesign the system. I have a saying I like to say that human error is a symptom of the system that needs to be redesigned.
Unlike aircraft, which were closer and closer every day to having unmanned systems, ships are still too complex to not rely so much on the people who run them.
You know, these are engineered systems that are designed, envisioned, and managed by people. And the challenge has been on the information side, where people who are in positions to make decisions don't have all of the information. And the more complex the system is, the larger the system it is, the more difficult it is to get the right information to the right people.
You could say back in the olden days, you know, an operator sat in front of a single radar scope. So almost the girth of their busyness had to do with what they could see on one radar scope. Today, an operator sits in front of a computerized display that is a mosaic of multiple radar scopes, as well as automatic identification system targets, electronic charts, all sorts of layers of data that the operator has to process.
And oftentimes, it's the oversaturation of information that technology brings that can lead to either fixation, so you become fixated on a single source of information, or distraction, where the various information sources you have distract you from the very real situation that's happening.
There's a sweet spot of how much information processing the operator needs to. You have too much and they're just overwhelmed. And that information that you thought you were giving that was critical just falls off the table and is missed and is lost.
At any given time, our brains are capable of processing certain units of information per certain units of time. So what happens if you're in an environment where the brain is overloaded with information and it can't control the tempo of the task? It makes mistakes. So your error rates go way up.
Adrenaline goes up. And suddenly I don't remember necessarily how to fix the problem, if I even understand what the problem is, because the cognitive tunneling sometimes makes me only look at a subset of the information. There may be other information that's very relevant that I didn't pick up on, and now an action that I take might actually make the problem worse.
Everything that isn't handled well in design, and we sometimes don't handle our design very well, we just say, oh, well, the operator's gonna somehow take care of that. And then we give them an impossible job and then blame them when they can't do it.
I think there's a danger too, as we become more software versus hardware focused, that we can solve this through software. I think that was part of the issue with the McCain accident, was by using touchscreens, we can solve a lot of issues because we can change things without having to build things.
They used a touchscreen to operate throttles, thinking that everything was linked or synced up. and it wasn't, so they slide up one side to increase the speed or decrease the speed, and it only affects one propulsion side of the ship, not both. Like they were, in their mind, they were picturing what was going to happen.
One of the things that could have helped the lee helmsman understand that the throttles were mismatched at the one point in the accident was if he could have just put his hand on throttles and realized with a tactile feel, it's always beneficial to have more than one sensory input, so both visually and tactile.
We have the human factors people here, for example, designing the control room. And then we have the engineers over here designing the hardware and the software, and they aren't talking to each other. And that used to work, and it doesn't anymore, especially with all the software, because the design of the software is inducing errors in the human operators. And it's not something you can just fix by changing the screen.
Pretty much every mishap, when you pull the thread, enough, you'll find that it goes back to a decision that was either made or not made that resulted in the system not fitting the human capabilities and limitations.
The other problem is, of course, the systems are never static. They change continually. And in fact, you want them to change, but most accidents occur after changes.
I worked one investigation where if you pushed a button, it meant one thing on this class of ship. If you pushed that same button on a sister ship or another class, it meant something totally different. So what happened is we had sailors come aboard that pushed this button expecting one thing to happen, and in reality, something totally opposite happened, which contributed to the mishap.
Okay, you're gonna encounter this problem, be sure not to do this. Oh, and there's this other problem, be sure not to do that. Oh, and for this situation, be sure you do this. And for that situation, do this. And before long, you've got 40 or 50 pieces of operator guidance that you have to tell that operator. Well, suddenly you've gone from just, one or two things, operator can remember that, to 40 or 50 things where it's an unrealistic expectation to think that operator's gonna know all of that.
This is a whole new problem because the cause of accidents has changed. And we're still using the old techniques that were developed for the old causes. You really have to use what's called systems theory, which was developed because of these complex systems in the 50s and 60s, and look at the system as a whole and build models and do analysis on the models and consider all the contributions.
They're envisioned and designed and operated and maintained by people. And so if you ignore that element of it, then there's a huge aspect of the risk portfolio that you're ignoring. And that's all knowable, preventable stuff. So why would you just ignore that when there's something that you can do about it if you kind of understand it?
Even if you're an engineer and you think of the systems theory of how our ships operate, the human part of that system is the most critical. And it's also the source of the most variability. And as an engineer, you feel like you should drive out variability. The safety engineers in us think that that variability is actually not only the source of some potential problems to overcome, but also the source of our ability to deal with complex situations, particularly when it's a new thing.
The problem is that so often we don't hear from the sailors because there's a number of bureaucratic and organizational layers between the fleet sailor on the deck plate and engineers in a laboratory somewhere, many of whom have actually never been on board a ship. The vast majority of our engineers have never actually been on a ship.
One example where that did happen was Boeing in the design of the 777. They had a design build team. They went out and they talked to pilots and they talked to maintenance people and they said, here's what we're thinking about. They showed them the diagrams and they got feedback. The maintenance guy says, if it's midnight and it's raining, I can't even see that thing that you now will have as the opening for me to do some oil change. Can't you make it more visible? And pilots, one of the things they said was, these switches, they feel exactly the same. Can't you make them feel differently so that if I'm pressing the wrong one, I know because I'll be able to get tactile feedback? And those are the kind of things which, could make an enormous difference.
When you have a new system or a new technology, you'll make your assumptions and then let's expose the operating group and see what the responses are.
There was a very robust report called the Comprehensive Review of the 2017 accidents. It's very clear that there were lapses in system understanding, okay? That communication between system and human. So one of the recommendations coming out of that report was to actually get human factors engineers installed in fleet concentration areas. Having human factors engineers there, at the waterfront, they can now take that pulse and say, oh, sailors are saying they're having issues here, here, and here. Let's take those back, and those become design recommendations.
What we know from everything from software design to mechanical equipment design, that you have to get the users engaged in the design process because they know a lot more than you might think. They know how is the tool being used under real life conditions. How large does the screen have to be or does the font have to be for me to notice it if I'm responsible for watching one screen while watching 3 others? If you're designing it in a vacuum, thinking about that one screen, you're going to make very different decisions than if you're designing it with 4 in mind.
Put it in front of the operators and they will be able to tell you, this is where I'm having difficulty. You will be able to get hard measures of these are the places where they made mistakes. Then root cause them and say, the operator made that mistake because he had a different mental model here. I need to make this particular piece of information more salient so they will better understand what action they should have taken.
You can evaluate your architecture, evaluate your concept of operations as you're doing the design, instead of waiting until you have a design and then have to try and evaluate it and find out it didn't work.
You're trying to make people from making cognitive errors that are rooted in either misdefining a problem, misspecification of how a system actually works, or just misunderstanding how it works. And for many of these accidents, like Deepwater Horizon is one, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, you can almost predict that somebody's going to be quoted as saying, I never knew it could do that. Oh, okay. It helps to have different perspectives on this system, not just a little part that somebody's familiar with, in order to get multiple ideas. And to put together the larger system perspective, you have to have people communicating.
It's seen by some as being a risk to schedule or a risk to the cost to the program. In reality, if you do the human factors right, you don't have to do rework later. And so it reduces your cost risk. It reduces your schedule risk. But it takes a while for some organizations to fully appreciate that.
It costs you nothing to do safety. You save money by making it safer.
Our focus is always on the team because that surface warfare in particular is a team sport. At any given time, any given day, we have at least 35 people on watch on one of our destroyers. And those people have to work together almost seamlessly, particularly when an anomaly comes up or something that's complex or unexpected. And on ships, there's no pause. The ship never stops sailing, and work never stops.
You're always on duty. You have divisional matters that you're working on. You have personnel matters. You have watch that you're standing. And then there are special evolutions, which require pre-briefings and safety meetings. You stay very busy, even in periods of time when it should be downtime.
And so you may have that procedure, that emergency procedure down pat. But if you are tired as hell, you may skip a step or you may forget a step, especially in the heat of the moment. Even the situations that take a long time to develop, it may happen very quickly for the watchstander, for the sailor that's involved, because they may have a million other things that's going on.
Overall, I think any high reliability organization have understood that in order to manage operational risk, you have to embed fatigue management processes, right? And to do so, you don't have to have people just write down how much they slept on a sheet of paper or something like that. You can actually bring in technology software that can help you manage that and do so very effectively. Those tools are out there, they're available today.
The technology that we're implementing is a tool to optimize the watch bill, the schedule for the duty shifts to happen. The technology was based on our commercial products, where we deliver tools for airlines and petrochemical companies and trucking companies to schedule operations in a way that accounts for the human factors and the fatigue. And so what those industries that have led have accomplished is they've developed tools and systems that allow them to quantify fatigue objectively. And then when they do identify fatigue, they have procedures to deal with it, to mitigate it, to reduce the fatigue risk.
What we really value is the ability to use data to help determine when someone may be at risk. We've been able to arm our frontline leaders with that information to say at a very minimum, we have to be on guard for drivers that are falling into this pattern based on the freight flows. We train our drivers on it as well, but you also want to make sure that you're providing leadership oversight to help keep them on a path where they are getting proper rest.
Those scheduling tools do provide an informed decision-making, and they provide an opportunity to determine if the risk is high enough to be mitigated. And frankly, having the data to suggest that where you are individually or your section is, that provides leaders and individuals with an opportunity to say, hey, listen, I don't feel comfortable in this scenario right now, and here's why.
We wanted to understand, how do you plan the activities that happen in a day? How do you account for the rest opportunity? And based on those interviews, we developed requirements, which then went into the OWL tool, which is the tool to optimize the watch bills, to plan and conduct daily activities in such a way that provides visibility and control over fatigue. That is, we need to know when a crew member is identified as not having a minimum amount of critical rest, and then we need to have procedures in place that we can implement to get that crew member that minimum rest so that we don't have him or her showing up for their watch or performing mission critical duties in an impaired state.
If there's an event that's created and scheduled and the sailor is expected to be in attendance to that event or a part of that event, and it's scheduled during their protected sleep period, it triggers a flag. That's not to say that the schedule has to change, but it's just something for decision makers on the ship to be aware of. It provides them actionable data, and they actually have a better understanding of what risk the ship is assuming.
If you have 50% of the crew, is in the red, if you will, in terms of sleep and sleep deficiency, what can be done at that point? How do you take action on that and better manage that? Because that's risk right there. And again, it just takes that right constellation for that group who's in the red to translate to the next safety-related incident.
The systems that we're building and putting into place will provide a quantitative objective framework that will identify to ship's leaders when individual crew members are not provided with adequate rest opportunity. And they will be given an instruction to stand down, go, rest, recover, and not relying on the individuals to raise their hand saying, I've had enough, I can't go on.
It's very difficult to judge your own performance decrement as you become fatigued. So because your decision-making is the first thing that goes, and particularly your risk decision-making becomes impaired as you become fatigued. So it's really difficult for people to figure out on their own that their performance is degraded. And we tend to lose sight of that as we're working through each day's things as being the goal. And you do that over and over and over again. Very quickly, you can end up in a point where you're in such a deficit that if something were to happen, like I have to go to combat now, you would not be in optimal condition.
The Navy's advantage is because the life space and the workspace happens on the ship under the visibility and control of the commanding officer, we have a big opportunity here to really do something that is highly effective. So one of the things that the OWL tool delivers is an efficient way to propagate changes through all the departments and the divisions on the ship. Those changes send sort of a shockwave through the schedule that needs to be absorbed, and you may have 3 or 4 or 5 or more of those shockwaves throughout the course of a day. And if you can just create a process to make those changes more efficient and to monitor for and mitigate fatigue within those changes, now you've really started to address the problem.
I'm familiar with the tool. I do think it's at the center of everything here because it is a practical solution. You can't manage a threat, right, if you're not actually tracking that threat. Fatigue is a threat. This gives us an opportunity to start tracking fatigue, so measuring fatigue, as well as then manage fatigue through the watch bill. And it's a very practical approach, something we can do now. There's no reason why we can't. It's just getting through the red tape to get that technology available widely for the Navy.
The other opportunity that we have is wearable data that we could actually have as a monitor of how people are sleeping and whether they're sleeping. Some of the wearable tools are a little bit more of an opportunity than they were 5 years ago.
So this is one that we are exploring. This is a ring-based sensor from Aura LTD. Like many fitness sensors, monitors heart rate, but they do have sleep algorithms that are providing research-grade information to our researchers in a shipboard environment.
What the wearables do is they provide a verification of actual crew member rest, not just the opportunity for rest. And that's a critical step in the process. It's invaluable information, and when you have it, it allows you to make very confident decisions. But the system still works even if we don't have every sailor wearing one of these wearables or watches.
And so that's the future, and that's a huge thrust of what we're trying to do in the crew program, is get that data collected in scale automatically, takes the burden off of the sailor. It's just pulled right in, and eventually we'll populate those dashboards within that OWL tool.
If the goal is to have the ship operate at their optimal level, assessment technologies and efforts really will help pay dividends for the people that are involved.
But people have to trust in the system, right? They have to trust that you're not going to use that information negatively against them. When I initially started a study on the Manchester, we had a really good take rate, but we communicated as this was an investment in them. This was an opportunity for them to better themselves in kind of a holistic way.
Including them throughout the development process is just good practice. It's what industry does. The military, unfortunately, suffers from overuse of a thing called corporate edict. That's what they call it out in the field, right? Is that the folks on top tell us what, again, we shall do at the bottom, and the folks at the bottom either have to kind of work around situations, or they do it and the outcome's kind of inefficient. So unfortunately, it's taken us a long time to realize this, but now we're taking this iterative approach, including the deference to expertise, and are hoping that the outcomes are going to be pretty easily handed off to the fleet at the end.
We can have all the research in the world, but if we don't start applying it and learning from it and learning from our sailors about it and about what they want, then it's all for nothing.
And so what we're trying to describe is what you think about how the systems work is never the same as how it actually works. And being able to figure that out is critically important if you're going to make small adjustments or get it back closer away from this margin to safety. And that's really the challenge for everybody, is as a production controller, as a commanding officer, as a guy who's accomplishing a mission, there are times when you are willing to sacrifice a little bit of your margin to safety in order to get something that's very important accomplished. Assuming you're aware of how close you are to that margin, though, is a bad assumption.